I had just hooked a fat largemouth base when I heard the unmistakable screech of a golf cart's tires on gravel. I knew that sound. It was the HOA queen herself, Nancy McDoyle, complete with her oversized sunglasses, clipboard, and her usual scowl like someone just insulted her potluck casserole. "Franklin Zeller," she barked like I'd just committed arson. "You are not authorized to fish here." I reeled in the base slowly, more amused than surprised. "Morning, Nancy. I'm fishing on my own property." "You know that, right?" Nancy stepped out of the cart like she owned the lake, her little yappy dog in tow wearing a rhinestone collar. "This area is common property controlled by the HOA. No fishing is permitted without a board-issued license." I raised an eyebrow. "Nancy, that dock is 15 feet onto my land. The property line runs right through here. I've got the survey maps and title to prove it." She waved her clipboard like it granted her divine power. "Franklin, this is your final warning. If I see you fishing here again, I will call the sheriff and press charges for trespassing." I laughed. "On my own land," she leaned in, lowering her voice. "Don't test me. The board has already voted." "You're not above the rules." She stormed off, but not before snapping a picture of me holding the fish like it was some criminal evidence. I stood there, stunned, not because I was intimidated, please, but because I realized what was really going on. That HOA boat launch, the one they'd slapped up next to my land last year. They used my shoreline without ever asking. I'd let it slide because it didn't bother me until now. They claimed I couldn't even fish in water that technically flowed through my own backyard. Well, Nancy just woke up a sleeping grizzly. I went inside, pulled out my files, and started digging. I had every property deed, survey, and city permit from the moment I bought that land 3 years ago. The boundary line clearly showed the boat launch encroached 10 feet onto my property. I called my buddy Caleb, former city engineer, now inspector for the county. "Hey man," I said, "you feel like checking out a little shoreline dispute?" He chuckled. "Let me guess, HOA again, bingo." By noon the next day, Caleb was out there with his equipment, measuring and squinting. "Franklin," he said, tapping his screen, "they built that launch 12 feet into your land. They didn't pull any permits either." That was all I needed. I filed a formal complaint with the zoning board and followed it up with a cease and desist letter to the HOA, demanding they stop using the launch immediately. I attached photos, the survey, and a notarized statement from Caleb. A week later, the HOA called an emergency meeting. And guess who was the star of the show? Yup, me. The clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee and mildew. Half the folding chairs were already filled when I walked in, but the second I stepped through the door, the room quieted like someone had hit the mute button. I didn't bother sitting. I just walked straight up to the front where the board was lined up behind a long table, pretending to look busy with their papers. Nancy sat in the center seat, her jaw set, pen tapping against her binder. She avoided eye contact, but the other board members glanced at me with that same uneasy expression you see on people who just realized the check engine light had been on for weeks. I didn't wait for them to start. "Your launch is on my land," I said, projecting so the whole room could hear. "You didn't ask for an easement, didn't apply for construction permits, didn't notify the zoning board. You built it illegally and you've been using it for over a year." One of the board members, Alan something, cleared his throat. "Mr. Zeller, this isn't the appropriate forum," Nancy cut him off. "We'll address this in the legal subcommittee. It doesn't concern the general membership." I pulled a manila envelope from under my arm and dropped it on the table. "It concerns every homeowner here." That envelope contains a cease and desist order, a copy of my property survey, and a letter from the county inspector confirming the encroachment. "You've been trespassing." There was a murmur behind me. A few neighbors leaned forward in their chairs. Nancy opened the envelope, scanned the first page, and stiffened. "This is a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "The board acted on good faith based on the old community plans. Those plans are outdated by 20 years, I replied, and they don't override private ownership." You've been collecting maintenance fees for that launch, charging people for access to land you don't own. More murmurs. A man in the back stood up. Wait, we've been paying for that dock. I thought it was common ground. Nancy stood, her voice sharp. This is all premature. Mr. Zeller has taken an aggressive and unnecessary approach. We were willing to negotiate. Negotiate? I raised an eyebrow. You threatened to have me arrested for fishing on my own property. Gasps. A woman near the front looked over at Nancy, frowning. Is that true? Nancy's cheeks flushed. I never said arrest. I said we would involve authorities to resolve a dispute. You told me you'd press charges for trespassing, I said, locking eyes with her. That's not a dispute. That's intimidation. Alan muttered something under his breath, but before anyone could respond, I pulled out my phone and connected it to the projector behind them. The screen lit up with a video Caleb standing on the shore, holding a GPS unit. Here's the footage from last Thursday. You'll see the launch's edge is nearly 12 feet onto my parcel. Here's the property line marker, here's the zoning map, and here's Caleb reading off the coordinates. Someone in the crowd let out a low whistle. Nancy looked like she was about to say something, but I cut her off again. I've also submitted a formal complaint to the city, and they've already assigned a code enforcement officer. This isn't going to disappear in committee. You've broken city ordinances and violated private property rights. The meeting ended in chaos. Several homeowners demanded refunds for the launch fees. Others started asking about other HOA amenities. Nancy tried to adjourn the meeting 3 times before finally giving up and storming out the side exit, her clipboard abandoned on the table. 2 days later, I got a letter from the HOA attorney. It was a weak attempt to pressure me into dropping the complaint in exchange for a good neighbor agreement. I didn't even dignify it with a response. Instead, I went straight to a property rights attorney named Dana McCree. She used to work for the state district court and had a reputation for dismantling overreaching HOAs with surgical precision. After reviewing my documents and the footage, Dana leaned back in her chair. This is more than a zoning violation. If they've used that dock to collect fees and it's on your land, you've got a case for unjust enrichment and civil trespass, possibly even fraud if they knowingly misrepresented ownership. She filed suit within a week. The HOA tried to play hardball. They filed a counterclaim accusing me of harassment, vandalism, and interference with community property. Problem was, they didn't have a shred of evidence. My cameras caught every angle of my property, and not once did I step near their launch after filing the cease and desist. When discovery hit, things started unraveling fast. Turns out, Nancy had pressured the previous board president into signing off on the launch without legal review. The construction invoice was altered to hide the location. And the worst part, they'd collected over $18,000 in fees over the last year from residents using the dock. Dana brought it all into court. The trial lasted 2 days. On the first day, the judge asked the HOA's attorney to explain why they never sought an easement or applied for permits. He stammered something about historical use, but Dana cut him down with a copy of the original subdivision plat, which made no mention of shared shoreline rights. On the second day, we showed video footage of Nancy telling a resident that the launch belongs to the community and has since the beginning. Dana followed that with a copy of the survey, the cease and desist, and testimony from Caleb, who brought his measuring equipment into the courtroom and demonstrated the encroachment using the judge's own laptop. Nancy refused to testify. Not surprising, the judge didn't take long. In light of the evidence, he said, leaning over his bench, this court finds the HOA knowingly constructed and profited from a structure on land they did not own. Mr. Zeller is awarded full control of the launch and surrounding area. Furthermore, the HOA is ordered to repay all collected fees and is barred from accessing the launch without explicit permission. He paused, then added, any attempt to retaliate will be considered contempt. I didn't even crack a smile. I just nodded and packed up my papers while Dana gave me a rare approving glance. Outside the courthouse, a few neighbors approached me. One of them, a retired postal worker named Letty, shook my hand. "I never liked that launch," she said. "Always felt like we were paying for something that didn't belong to us. Glad someone finally stood up to them." That night, I returned home and stood on my dock with a quiet satisfaction. I didn't want revenge, I wanted boundaries respected. And now, they'd been carved in legal stone. I didn't put up a fence, didn't need to. Word spread fast. The HOA sent out a new newsletter a week later with a tiny paragraph buried on the second page. "The community boat launch is currently closed for maintenance." Everyone knew better. It wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. And I still fish there every Saturday morning. 2 weeks after the court ruling, things in the neighborhood were quieter, but not exactly settled. The HOA newsletter stopped arriving, the board's Facebook page went dark, and Nancy's golf cart hadn't been seen cruising the sidewalks once. Not that I missed it, but then something strange happened. I got a letter in a plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a grainy color photo of my dock taken at night and a single typed sentence. "Enjoy it while you can." No signature, no explanation. I stared at it for a long time. Someone had trespassed onto my property, taken a picture, and mailed it anonymously. It wasn't just creepy, it was stupid. Because I had added 2 motion-activated trail cams near the shoreline after the court ruling. And those cameras didn't just record footage, they uploaded it to a secure cloud account the moment they detected movement. I pulled up the footage from the past 48 hours and found it almost immediately. Around 2 in the morning the previous night, a figure in a hooded sweatshirt crept across the edge of my yard, paused by the dock, and held up a phone. He or she stood there for 30 seconds before vanishing back into the trees. I couldn't see the face, but I could see the shoes' bright red soles, like something out of a fashion catalog. Which made it even more bizarre when, that afternoon, I spotted Alan, the HOA board member who had sat next to Nancy at that last meeting, walking to his mailbox wearing those same shoes. I didn't confront him. Yet, instead, I forwarded the footage to the local police with a formal trespassing report. I also called Dana and let her know I suspected retaliation was brewing. She didn't sound surprised. "That ruling humiliated them," she said. "You stripped away their illusion of authority. They're not going to let it go easily." 3 days later, the situation escalated. I came home from work to find 4 uniformed deputies parked outside my house. One of them, a younger officer with a nervous energy, stepped forward holding a folded sheet of paper. "Mr. Zeller, that's me. We received a report of unauthorized construction on protected wetlands, specifically an illegal dock extension built without a permit." I blinked. "You're standing on it. That's not an extension. That's the same dock that was in court 3 weeks ago." Another officer, older and more skeptical, squinted at the structure. "You got documentation for that?" I handed him a copy of the court ruling and the parcel survey. He read it silently while the younger deputy paced along the waterline. "Who filed the complaint?" I asked. The younger one answered, "Anonymous tip. Claimed recent construction activity in violation of conservation codes." I didn't bother guessing who it was. I just pointed toward the trail cam mounted near the base of a pine tree. "That camera's been recording 24/7. You're welcome to pull the last month of footage. You'll find 0 construction and 1 trespasser." They took the footage and left without further incident. But it was obvious. The board, likely led by Nancy, was trying to weaponize the county to harass me into submission. Only they didn't realize I wasn't the only one they'd crossed. That weekend, I received a call from Letty, the retired postal worker. She sounded uneasy. "I don't want to get involved," she said, "but I think you should know. Nancy's been going door to door asking for signatures. She's telling people you forged the property documents and that the judge was your cousin." I couldn't help but laugh once. "I don't even have a cousin in this state. She's also saying you threatened her physically, that she's scared for her safety." That stopped me cold. "Has she filed a police report?" "Not yet, but she claims she has witnesses." I thanked Letty and hung up, then I called Dana again. "She's trying to set you up," Dana said flatly. "False accusations, harassment complaints, trying to poison the well, will get ahead of it." Dana filed a restraining order against Nancy on my behalf the next day. Not because I was afraid of her, but because it gave us legal footing to keep her away from my property and to preempt any bogus accusations she might try to float. But things took a turn I wasn't expecting. A week after the restraining order was granted, I got a call from Officer Rollins, the same older deputy who had come out to check the dock. "We need you to come down to the station, Mr. Zeller. We've run into something." Serious. When I arrived, Rollins led me into a back room where a detective was scrolling through surveillance footage on a laptop. I recognized the feed. It was from my own trail cam, though this time it showed something new, a different night, a different figure. In the footage, two people approached the dock around midnight. One held a crowbar. The other carried what looked like a gas can. They pried loose a plank near the end of the dock, poured something onto it, and lit a match. The flame flared up briefly, but then fizzled out almost immediately, probably because the wood was treated and damp from the lake. They panicked and ran off into the trees. The detective paused the feed, zoomed in on the person holding the gas can. Then he turned the laptop toward me. "Recognize him?" It was Alan. Same red-soled shoes, hood pulled back just enough to show that ridiculous salt and pepper ponytail he always wore. "You're sure this is your property?" the detective asked. I nodded. "I filed the survey with the county. That dock is mine." "They tried to burn it." He didn't respond right away, just leaned back in his chair. "We're opening a criminal investigation. Arson, conspiracy, trespassing, possibly more, depending on what else we find. This isn't a prank anymore." The next morning, Nancy and Alan were both arrested. Turns out, the police had searched Alan's home and found the gas can in his garage, still half full. They found a printed map of my property lines with red X's marked along the shoreline. And they found something else: financial statements showing Alan had approved reimbursement funds from HOA dues for shoreline reinforcement materials that were never purchased. The HOA had been siphoning funds into fake maintenance projects for over a year, and Alan had been the one handling the books. It took less than 48 hours for the rest of the board to resign. One by one, they submitted formal letters to the city clerk's office. By the end of the week, the HOA's account was frozen, and the county had opened an audit into its finances. Nancy posted bail but disappeared from the neighborhood. Alan wasn't so lucky. He was charged with attempted arson and embezzlement. His trial was pending, but the evidence was overwhelming. As for the rest of the community, something shifted. People who had kept quiet before started speaking up. One neighbor revealed that Nancy had threatened to fine her for having a non-regulation mailbox, even though it was the same one installed by the builder. Another shared a story about being forced to repaint his fence 3 times in one summer because the shade of white wasn't consistent. A group of us met in the community park, unofficially, of course. We talked about forming a new neighborhood council, not an HOA. Just a group of residents who wanted to keep things civil and look out for each other. Nobody wanted power, we just wanted peace. I didn't volunteer for anything. I'd done my part. But when the vote came to select someone to represent the community at city meetings, they chose me anyway. "You're the only one who stood up to them," Letty said. "The only one who didn't flinch." I couldn't argue with that. One evening, I walked back to the dock. The sun was setting over the water. I sat at the edge, feet dangling. The plank still bore the faint scorch marks from the attempted fire, a reminder of how far some people would go to cling to control. But the dock was still standing. So was I. And for the first time in a long while, the lake was quiet again. Peaceful. Mine, no threats, no fines, no HOA. Just the sound of frogs in the reeds and a fishing pole in my hand. 3 months passed. The sun rose earlier now, and the lake shimmered like polished glass at dawn. My dock had been reinforced with new boards paid for out of pocket, but I didn't mind. The burn marks were gone, replaced with cedar that still smelled sharp and clean in the morning air. I hadn't heard a word from Nancy or Alan since their arrests. Not that I expected to. Nancy had left the state. Her bail conditions included staying away from me and the property. Alan was still awaiting trial, and after the evidence Dana helped uncover, his attorney had all but disappeared from public view. Meanwhile, the community had changed. Without the HOA operating, neighbors started handling things themselves. A retired mechanic named Joe mowed the cul-de-sac's shared green patch. A couple of teenagers from down the block offered to repaint the weather-worn park benches for free. People waved more often. Conversations happened on sidewalks instead of inside tense meetings. I was heading back from the hardware store one afternoon when I spotted a sheriff's cruiser parked in front of my house. Deputy Rollins stepped out before I even reached my driveway. "Franklin," he said, tipping his hat. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" I unlocked the front door and gestured toward the kitchen. "Coffee's fresh." He shook his head. "Appreciate it, but I won't be long." He pulled a folded document from his vest pocket. "County prosecutor's office wanted you to have this." "It's confirmation that Alan took a plea deal." I took the paper and scanned it. "How much time's he getting?" 7 years. He admitted to attempted arson, misappropriation of community funds, and filing false financial records with the city. Prosecutor dropped the conspiracy charge in exchange for full restitution. I set the paper down. "Restitution to who?" Rollins gave a humorless chuckle. "You, for damages to your property. And the HOA account, which is now being dissolved under court supervision. Funds are being returned proportionally to residents." That caught me off guard. "Wait, they're dissolving the HOA?" Judge signed the order last week. Between the financial misconduct, unapproved construction, and documented threats, the county ruled it was operating well outside its legal bounds. "They're calling it a forced disbandment." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "That's rare." "Hasn't happened in this district in over 20 years, Rollins said, "but your case gave them more than enough grounds." He hesitated, then added, "There's one other thing. Thought you should know. One of Nancy's old board members, a guy named Travis he's decided to talk, gave a full statement. Apparently, Nancy was planning to use the boat launch to push for a private marina designation. She started the process without telling anyone." I frowned. "Why would she do that?" Rollins pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, and turned it around. A satellite image of the lake appeared, overlaid with zoning markers. Private marina status would have given her the right to lease dock slips at a premium. She had a side deal with some real estate guy out of state. They'd already drafted the paperwork. She just needed to show proof of community ownership. I blinked. She was going to turn it into a business. Exactly, and she needed your shoreline to do it. That's why she fought so hard to pretend it was HOA land. Without it, the square footage didn't qualify. I let out a low whistle. She almost pulled it off. "Until you reeled in a fish," Rollins said dryly. "Funny how these things start." He left after that, and I sat with the document for a while, thinking about everything that had happened. What began as a petty power play had almost turned into a full-blown fraud operation. They weren't just trying to control a dock, they were trying to rewrite ownership for profit. Later that week, I attended a meeting at the community center, not an HOA meeting, just residents figuring out how to move forward. It was the first time I'd been in that room without tension hanging in the air. Letty was there along with Joe and a dozen others. The chairs were rearranged in a circle. No head table, no clipboards. "We need to decide who's going to handle the transition paperwork," Letty said. "The city's given us 60 days to establish a civic council or let them appoint one." Someone across from me spoke up. "Franklin should do it. He already handled the hard part." I shook my head. "I'm not looking to run anything, just want things to stay fair." Letty smiled. "That's exactly why you should help." We put it to a vote. I agreed to act as interim liaison for the city only until the paperwork was finalized. No power, no committees. just helping close out the HOA's contracts and making sure the neighborhood wasn't left in limbo. Over the following weeks, I spent a few evenings reviewing HOA documents with Dana. Most of it was boilerplate nonsense, but buried in one file was a set of emails between Nancy and an attorney from Clearwater Holdings, the real estate firm Rollins had mentioned. The emails outlined a profit-sharing agreement based on boat slip rentals. Nancy had promised exclusive access to the shoreline for 10 years. Dana flagged it immediately and forwarded it to the prosecutor's office. It was further proof of intent to defraud the community. The state opened a separate investigation into Clearwater Holdings. By then, Nancy had gone completely silent. According to the last update I received, she was facing civil penalties for breach of fiduciary duty and wire fraud. Her assets were frozen, including the condo she had quietly purchased under a shell company near the lake's northern ridge. No one saw her again. With the HOA officially dissolved, the boat launch was reclassified as private property. I posted a weatherproof sign at the edge of the dock. Private shoreline, access by permission only. I never charged anyone, but I made sure people asked. One morning, a boy from 2 blocks over knocked on my door holding a tackle box and a nervous look. "Sir, would it be okay if I fished off your dock? I heard it's real good for bass." I opened the door wider. "You bring your own bait?" "Yes, sir." "Then you're welcome to it." He grinned and took off running toward the lake. That afternoon, I found a hand-drawn thank you note taped to my mailbox. Crayon fish and all, it reminded me why I fought in the first place. Not for the dock, not for the lawsuit, for the idea that no one should be bullied off their own land. That power, when abused, collapses under its own weight. By the time summer rolled in, the lake was busier than usual. Not crowded, just lived in. Families picnicked by the reeds. Kids skipped stones. The whisper of control that had once gripped our neighborhood was gone, replaced by something quieter and stronger. Trust. And sometimes, when the water was still and the breeze just right, I'd cast my line and wait, knowing full well that I wasn't just fishing. I was free.